My stepmom raised her glass, looked me straight in the eye, and said, "To Bella's real career, and to Avery's lowly little military job." The room burst into laughter, sharp and careless, echoing against the walls of my father's house in Clarksville, Tennessee. I felt every chuckle land on my skin like heat from a stove. My father sat at the head of the table, smiling at the decorations and the crowd, but he did not defend me. It was his 60th birthday, and yet somehow I had become the entertainment piece served up for ridicule. Bella, the future doctor, sat glowing in the middle of the room, while Cynthia rested a proud hand on her shoulder. To them, she was everything. I was something they tolerated when they remembered I existed. Cynthia leaned back in her chair and announced to the room, "She plays soldier, while real adults build real lives." Laughter again, louder this time. A distant aunt chimed in with, "Well, at least your lowly military profession pays the gas for those army trucks, right?" Everyone laughed except me. I swallowed hard and stared at the kitchen tile, pretending I did not hear the words that had followed me all my life. Lowly, unimportant, forgettable. I had shown up in my dress uniform because my father once told me it made him proud. Tonight he could not even look me in the eye. I tried to hold myself together and focused on keeping my breathing steady. I excused myself and carried empty plates to the sink. Cynthia followed just long enough to add another sting. "You are used to following orders anyway. Help with the dishes." She said it with a smile that did not reach her eyes, then walked away to entertain more guests. I kept scrubbing plates, feeling anger rise in my throat. Anger mixed with years of disappointment, confusion, and quiet heartbreak. This was not new. This was routine. Toxic family moments like these had shaped me since childhood, and yet the sting never dulled. I dried my hands and checked my watch, not out of impatience, but out of calculation. In exactly 43 minutes, 200 soldiers would march down this quiet Tennessee street, and none of them were here for Cynthia or Bella or anyone else in that room. They were here for me, for the version of me my family never cared to know, the version that existed outside this house, the version forged by deployments, long nights in freezing training fields, missions that walked the edge between life and loss. The woman they saw was the awkward, quiet girl they had dismissed for years. The woman I actually was carried a truth they had never earned. My name is Avery Calder. I am 27 years old. I am a captain in the 101st Airborne Division stationed at Fort Campbell. My call sign is Valkyrie 3. I have led soldiers through ambush fire-controlled chaos with precision and stood between my people and danger more times than I can count. I have been featured in internal Pentagon training videos, and my story has circulated throughout bases across the country. But according to my stepmom, I am the family disappointment with a lowly military profession. According to the 200 soldiers approaching my father's street, I am something very different. I returned to the living room in time to hear Cynthia brag again about Bella's bright future, her perfect grades, her perfect prospects, her perfect life. Someone glanced at me and asked, politely, how my job was going. Before I could open my mouth, Cynthia waved her hand and said, "She means she is still stuck in that lowly job." It is cute, really. I felt every muscle in my body go still. I looked at her face lit by warm party lights, unaware that her words were seconds from shattering on the pavement outside. My phone buzzed in my pocket. 3 words appeared on the screen. "Valkyrie, we are here." I stepped outside just as the first Humvee turned onto our street engines, rumbling strong and steady. Neighbors stepped out onto their porches, confused, then pulled out their phones to record. 1 Humvee became 2, then 3, then 4. And then the formation of soldiers walking in perfect sync, rounding the corner with precision that made grown men straighten their backs. Cynthia finally stepped outside, following the crowd. She stared at the uniforms, the disciplined march, the sheer scale of it. Her smile evaporated. For the first time all evening, she was completely silent. When the final vehicle stopped in front of the driveway and 200 soldiers lined up shoulder to shoulder facing the porch, she took one small step backward. By the time they saluted, it was already too late for her to take back anything she had ever said. If you have ever had someone laugh at your work, your service, or your worth, stay with me. This is not just a story about soldiers. It is a story about quiet justice and what happens when silent revenge finally walks right up to the door. My stepmom stood frozen on that porch as 200 soldiers saluted, but they were not the ones who first taught me how it felt to be invisible. My own house did that long before the Army ever put a uniform on my back. I grew up in Murfreesboro, Tennessee, in a small one-story house that smelled like coffee and lemon cleaner. When my mom was alive, she kept framed photos along the hallway, snapshots of me with missing teeth, my dad in a cheap suit on his way to work. The three of us squeezed together on a worn-out couch that sagged in the middle, but felt like the safest place on earth. I was 12 when cancer turned my mother into a stranger. The chemo stole her hair, and then her laugh. And by the time she went into hospice, the house felt like it was already holding its breath, as if the walls knew she was not coming back. After she died, my father lasted maybe a year before Cynthia appeared a real estate agent, with white teeth, perfect nails, and a voice that always sounded like it was rehearsing for a commercial. She stepped into our house with a tape measure in one hand and a hard smile on her face. She called it a fresh start. I called it an eraser. The first weekend after they got married, she walked down the hallway with a laundry basket stopped in front of the photos of my mom, and me shook her head and said to my father, "We do not need to live in the past." Frank, your first wife, is not part of this family story. Now then, she took each frame off the wall and placed it in the basket, like clutter being removed from a listing. I followed her out to the garage where she stacked the photos on top of paint cans and Christmas boxes my mother reduced to storage, while my father said nothing. I opened my mouth to ask if we could at least keep one picture in the living room, but he caught my eye and gave me a look that said, "Please do not start." He was tired and scared of conflict, and I learned fast that his silence was not neutral. It chose her side every single time. Cynthia painted the living room a neutral gray, replaced our sagging couch with something stiff and beige, brought in new lamps, new rugs, new rules she started calling the house our home and our fresh chapter. But whenever she said our, she meant hers and my father's, not mine, and certainly not my mother's. Around that time, I found JROTC at school, and for the first time since my mother died, something made sense again. The program smelled like sweat and floor polish. The uniforms were scratchy, and the boots were cheap, but there was structure and purpose. And adults who looked you in the eye and meant what they said, it felt like a language I already knew. My instructor was a retired first sergeant with a gravelly voice and a gaze that could cut through excuses. He watched me lead a small drill team one afternoon, my commands loud and steady afterward. He called me over and said, "You think like an officer Calder. You see the whole field, not just your own feet." It was the first real compliment I remembered since my mom died, and it settled somewhere deep in my chest like a pilot light. I went home that day still wearing part of my uniform, clutching a pamphlet about scholarships at dinner. I tried to tell my dad there were paths to college through the Army that I could serve and study, that it was not just yelling and push-ups before he could answer. Cynthia laughed and said she likes the costume and the attention that is not a real future. Her voice smooth and dismissive, my dad let the subject drop and moved on to asking Bella about her homework, as if my words had never landed on the table at all. Bella was Cynthia's daughter from her first marriage. She moved in a few months after the wedding, a year younger than me, but somehow already the main character in every room. She got an SAT tutor. Summer programs, a used car that Cynthia called a reward for excellence, while I bagged groceries at the supermarket to pay for my own phone, my own shoes, my own cadet trips. She had planners and prep books, and a mother dedicated to curating her success. I had a part-time schedule board and a father who kept saying, "We will see," whenever I asked for anything that cost more than $20. At family dinners, Cynthia would swirl her wine and launch into small sermons about real success. She would say, "Real success is degrees, white coats, corner offices, not boots and mud." She said it like a joke, but her eyes always flicked toward my JROTC jacket, hanging on the back of my chair, a reminder of where she thought I belonged. My dad would chuckle. Not because it was funny, but because laughing was easier than disagreeing with his new wife. His silence became a steady hum in the background, a signal to everyone at the table about whose future mattered and whose did not. I learned to keep my plans to myself. I stopped bringing home ribbons to show them. I stopped sharing stories about leadership labs or field exercises at school. I was the cadet who could organize a squad in seconds and calm down a panicking freshman before an inspection at home. I was the quiet girl who cleared plates and watched Bella soak up every ounce of praise, the invisible daughter in a house that only had room for one golden child at a time. The first time my first sergeant pulled me aside and talked seriously about an Army scholarship, I felt both excited and guilty excited, because someone saw potential in me beyond the role of household extra guilty, because I could already hear Cynthia saying I was running away, saying I was choosing a low path instead of climbing the ladder. She understood part of me wanted to stay and fight for recognition on her terms, but the larger part of me knew those terms were rigged. The game in that house had been fixed from the moment she put my mother's photos in a box. When I think back on those years, what cuts deepest is not just the sharp comments or the obvious favoritism. It is the small, ordinary moments that taught me where I ranked the way Cynthia would introduce us at church as, "This is my daughter Bella. She is on the pre-med track, and this is Frank's daughter. Avery, she helps out with the school cadet thing." The way relatives would nod politely at me, then immediately ask Bella where she planned to go to medical school, as if my future existed only in the blank space around hers. Years later, standing in my father's yard in Clarksville with 200 soldiers behind me, I could still see that hallway in Murfreesboro. In Cynthia's mind, I had never really moved past that awkward teenager in a cheap cadet uniform who smelled like sweat and effort. She still pictured me as the girl playing soldier while real adults built real lives. She'd frozen me there because it made her feel taller. What she did not know, what almost everyone in that neighborhood did not know, was that on base my face was on a very different kind of wall. Young soldiers printed screenshots from an internal training video and taped them up in barracks and offices. A still frame of me in full combat gear, giving calm orders under fire. Under it, someone had written Valkyrie 3, the one who brought the convoy home. I had become a quiet legend in a world my family had never bothered to ask about in their house. I was still invisible, but out there I was the name people called when things got dangerous and they wanted to live through it, and that gap between their story about me and the truth was finally starting to close. Senior year felt less like a finish line and more like a measuring stick held up in the middle of our living room in 2015. Every adult around me seemed to be weighing futures, and from the way they spoke, it was clear mine did not count the same way Bella did. The day her Vanderbilt envelope arrived, I came home from a shift at the grocery store and found Cynthia at the counter with scissors in one hand and Bella practically vibrating beside her. She sliced the top, pulled out the letter, and when she saw the words admitted and scholarship, she clapped a hand over her mouth, then turned to my father with tears in her eyes and said, "Our future doctor is going to Vanderbilt." God really bless this family. My dad hugged. Bella kissed Cynthia. Repeated, "We always knew you would do something important." The bag in my hands grew heavier by the second. I set it down quietly and no one asked how my day had been. That weekend, Cynthia announced we were hosting a celebration dinner. She said the phrase like it was a brand celebration dinner for our future doctor. She ordered food from a place we never ate at on normal nights, polished the good silver-printed place cards, and hung a banner across the dining room that said exactly what she had named, "The night our future doctor." My name never appeared in any of her planning sentences, unless it followed, "Can you help?" or "Can you pick up?" I moved chairs, fetched ice, answered the door. She moved through the house like the director of a show she had written for herself and Bella. Upstairs in my dresser drawer, I had my own letter, not on fancy university paper, but on simple government stock and army packet explaining an enlistment option and a scholarship route that would cover college. If I committed to serve, there was a schedule for Fort Jackson notes on how to become an officer, a scribbled comment from my JROTC instructor that said, "This fits you." Calder, you think like an officer. When I looked at those pages, I could see a life with structure and purpose, a future where my work mattered to someone. But when I tried to imagine holding them up next to Bella Vanderbilt letter in Cynthia Perfect Kitchen, I could already hear her laugh, feel the sting before it landed. So I closed the drawer and told myself there was time, even though some quiet, honest part of me knew there probably was not. The night of the dinner, the house in Murfreesboro looked like one of Cynthia listings, the one staged just enough to feel like no one actually lived there. Candles on the table, borrowed wine glasses, rented china, relatives and church friends arriving with cards addressed to Bella. They hugged her and said, "Doctor in the family. Imagine that your parents must be so proud." My father beamed. Cynthia floated from guest to guest like a hostess in an advertisement. I carried coats to the bedroom, refilled bowls of salad, checked the oven. Finally, my dad waved me toward a chair and I slid into a seat near the end of the table, where the light from the kitchen spilled across my plate. The place card in front of me said, Avery in a neat small script. 2 seats over Bella place card had her full name written large with a tiny drawn heart beside it, a detail no one else noticed but me. A detail that summed up the whole room. We filled our plates. The low hum of conversation settled in. Forks clicked against china. The air felt thick with pride that did not belong to me. My father tapped his fork against his glass and stood. He talked about how hard Bella had worked and how proud he was, his voice thick with emotion. I had not heard from him in years. When he sat down, Cynthia rose as if the moment belonged to her next. She listed test scores and application essays, late nights and early mornings. The miles she had driven to tutoring, she said over and over that God had honored their dedication. People nodded and murmured approval. I ate in small, careful bites and waited, not sure if anyone would remember there was another senior at the table. One person did my uncle, who sold hardware and never seemed impressed by polished resumes. He looked down the table and asked, "So Avery, what are you doing after graduation? You are finishing this year too, right?" The room went a little quieter. I felt every eye slide toward me. I swallowed and said, "I am joining the Army, Fort Jackson for basic first. Then I want a commission. I have been talking to a recruiter about an Army scholarship." The words came out steady. I was proud of them for exactly 1 second. Then Cynthia laughed. Bright and sharp, the kind of laugh that signals everyone else it is safe to laugh too. She tilted her head and said, "So no real college, just yelling and doing push-ups." A few guests chuckled on cue. She added, "Military is fine for kids who cannot get real scholarships. At least you will have free laundry and food on base." Someone muttered camp with uniforms under their breath. My father gave a small, tight smile and added, "Well, it will give you discipline, I guess." And in 4 short sentences, they turned my future into a punchline. The air left my chest, like I had been hit, even though I was still sitting in my chair. Heat climbed up my neck. I stared at the pattern on my plate so I would not have to see any one expression. I heard the clink of glasses, the scrape of a chair, someone shifting uncomfortably and then choosing silence. I felt that old familiar mix of shame and distance settle over me. The feeling of being present and invisible at the same time, but this time something else slid in under it. A clear, simple thought that put its feet down and refused to move fine. If I am not your investment, I will not be your burden. I did not say it out loud. There was no point. I just held it like a stone in my hand and turned it over while the conversation drifted back to dorm assignments and meal plans and Bella new life in Nashville. By the time dessert arrived, that sentence had settled into me deeper than any toast. After everyone left and the house went quiet, I went upstairs, closed my door and took out the Army packet again. The same words looked different. Now pay charts were not just numbers, They were distance every line about benefits, felt like another inch of space between my choices, and Cynthia approval. I opened my old laptop and made a simple plan how much I would earn in basic, what I could save if I kept expenses low, how soon I could pay for classes without asking anyone for help. At the top of the document, I typed the same sentence that had been echoing in my head since the table. If I am not their investment, I will not be their burden. It was not poetic, but it was mine. And seeing it on the screen made it feel like a decision instead of just a feeling, of just. A week later, I sat in the recruiter's office, a small space with faded posters and a humming air conditioner, when he slid the direct deposit form toward me and asked where I wanted my pay to go. I knew my answer. I had already gone to the bank on my day off, opened an account with just my name on it. No joint access, no parental signature. I gave him the routing number and account number and watched him type them in to him. It was routine paperwork to me. It was the first real step in a life where my money and my effort did not pass through hands that mocked the work behind them. Walking out into the Tennessee heat that afternoon, I realized the celebration dinner had done me one unexpected favor. It had made the family betrayal clear enough that I could stop pretending it might fix itself that night, had shown me exactly how little they respected my choice. So in response, I chose something they would never see until it was too late. I chose to keep my future tied to my own decisions, my own bank account, my own quiet line out of their control. It was not loud revenge. There were no dramatic speeches or slam doors, just paperwork and a private vow. But it was the first drop on the roller coaster that would eventually bring 200 soldiers to my father's front yard and leave Cynthia with nothing to toast but her own words. Basic training in 2016 felt like stepping onto a different planet. The air at Fort Jackson was thick and wet. The days started in darkness and never really slowed down. Drill sergeants barked boots, pounded gravel. And for the first time in my life, the orders in my ears made more sense than the voices waiting back home. There was a strange comfort in the way the Army broke us all down to the same level and then started building us up again. Nobody cared whose mom sold houses or who got into Vanderbilt. They cared if you could keep moving when your lungs burned and your legs shook, if you could learn fast, listen hard, and not quit when everything in you screamed to stop. On Sundays, when we finally had a sliver of time, I would sit on my bunk with a pen and write letters. One to my father and Cynthia, one to my JROTC instructor, sometimes one to myself, because it felt like I was trying to keep a record of the person I was becoming. I told my father about early morning ruck marches, about learning to fire my weapon, about the surprising peace I felt when every minute of my day had a purpose. I kept the tone light. No complaints. I mentioned the recruiter had said once I finished training and got to my duty station, my steady pay could help with the mortgage. I wrote that line because I knew he lay awake at night thinking about money, and because some part of me still hoped being useful might finally look like value to him. After basic came AIT, more training, new faces, new routines, then orders to the 101st Airborne at Fort Campbell. I remember holding the packet in my hands and feeling something like pride wrap itself around the old ache I carried from home. This division had history names that meant something in the military world. I arrived with my duffel bag and my quiet Tennessee accent and threw myself into the work. The early months were a blur of field exercises maps spread out on hoods, briefings that stretched late into the night, and little by little, I earned the trust of people who had no reason to give it to me, except my performance. There was no room for the invisible girl I had been at the family table here. You either showed up or you did not, and everyone saw the difference. When my first deployment came up, my father tried to sound supportive on the phone, but I could hear the edge of fear under his words. I told him I would be fine, that I trusted my team, that it was what I had trained for. He stumbled over the word proud twice before letting Cynthia take the receiver. She said, "Our girl is off playing soldier," in a tone that tried to sound fond but landed more like a joke. She told me the neighbors were impressed. There was someone in uniform in the family that she always mentioned my service at church. The way she said it made it feel like a prop in her social life, not a reality in mine, but I let it slide. I had more pressing things to focus on than her need for status. Before we left, I sat down with finance and set up an allotment. I decided to send a chunk of each paycheck home. I imagined my father shaving a little off the mortgage each month, maybe fixing the leak in the roof he'd complained about for years, maybe building a small buffer, so that when I came back we could talk about a down payment on a place near base somewhere that belonged to me. I knew I did not owe them that money, but I also knew what deployment pay looked like, and it felt better to turn part of it towards something concrete than let it sit unused. I told myself this was my choice, and because it was my choice, it could not be used to make me feel small. Deployment blurred into a series of long, hot days, dust choking the air, the smell of fuel and sweat, the constant readiness that coiled in the back of my mind, even when I tried to sleep. We ran convoys, checked routes, sat through briefings on threats and patterns, and the 100 small details that can make the difference between everyone coming back and someone not coming back at all. There were close calls and long stretches of boredom jokes tossed back and forth to keep the edge off. I learned what my face felt like when I had to stay calm so other people would not break. I learned what my own fear sounded like and how to move anyway. On the rare nights when we had a stable connection, I would see messages from Cynthia on social media, photos of church events, birthday cakes, real estate signs with her smiling beside them. Sometimes she tagged my father and wrote proud of our family provider or blessed beyond measure. Sometimes there would be a line about our girl overseas playing soldier for the country, accompanied by an emoji. It always felt like she was talking about a character and not about me, the real person, reading it in a plywood building halfway across the world. Month after month, the allotments went out automatically, numbers moving from my pay to the joint account my father and Cynthia used. I pictured my father watching the balance and breathing a little easier. I pictured him telling Cynthia, "This is Avery, helping, this is our kid doing something solid." I did not know if he actually said that, but I needed to believe the money meant something, and not just to the bank. When I finally rotated home after 9 long months, the air in Tennessee felt too soft and too quiet. I took a few days before going to visit my father, partly because I needed space to remember how to be around civilians again, and partly because stepping back into that house always felt like walking into a memory I had not consented to keep when I did drive out to Murfreesboro. The yard looked the same as ever. The siding needed a power wash. The porch light flickered. But there was a newer car in the driveway, a shiny, compact sedan with a dealership tag still on the back. My first thought was that my father had finally gotten rid of his old truck. My second was that I had never seen this model on any of his wish lists. Inside the house, Cynthia greeted me with exaggerated warmth. "You look so grown up," she said, turning me under the light as if she were inspecting a piece of furniture. My father hugged me and held on a little longer than usual. Then we all sat down in the kitchen. It did not take long for me to ask about the money. I kept my tone neutral. I said, "I know the allotments have been going through. I wanted to check how much made it toward the mortgage and how much we have in savings." My father shifted in his chair. His eyes slid toward Cynthia. He said, "Well, we have been meaning to talk to you about that." Before he could find the words, she slid right in. "We had to use most of it," she said briskly. "Bella med school bills came due. You know how expensive that is, and the house needed repairs, the roof, the plumbing, a few things you do not see on the surface. Family helps family, right?" She smiled like she had said something noble. My father nodded without looking at me. Heat surged in my chest. I asked slowly, "So you used almost a year of deployment pay without asking me?" First, she blinked as if I had missed the point. "Real sacrifice is paying real bills, Avery. Not playing war in the desert. We kept this house afloat while you were off on your little adventure. That is what families do. You help where you can." The words landed like a slap. The way she said playing war erased every moment of danger. Every sleepless night, every face I had prayed would still be there at morning roll call. She twisted my attempt to help into a duty I had somehow failed. Even as I fulfilled it, this was not just about money, it was gaslight tied with a bow. A classic toxic family move that said, "You owe us and you are ungrateful for questioning how we use what you sent." I sat very still and looked at my father, waiting for him to correct her, to say they should have talked to me, to acknowledge even once that the money I earned did not appear from thin air. He opened his mouth, closed it, and finally said, "Your stepmom is right. It all went to important things. You did good, kiddo." Then he changed the subject to church renovations, as if our conversation were a faucet he could simply turn off. Driving back to base that evening, I felt something in me harden the stone I had picked up at the scholarship dinner, when they mocked my ROTC plans, settled into place beside a new one. This one heavier, carved by the knowledge that they saw my effort as a resource to be stripped, and not as a gift to be respected. The story financial part of my life, the numbers and charts and plans I had made for a future home, had just collided with the reality of family betrayal. I realized that sending my earnings into their account made it possible for them to spin my service as both a prop and a piggy bank, and I knew I could not let that continue. The next week, I sat in the personnel office at Fort Campbell and filled out new forms. The clerk barely glanced up as I changed the beneficiary on my life insurance, from my father to a split 50% to a veteran charity that funded mental health care for people like the ones I served, beside 50% to the battle buddy who had pulled me out of the path of a vehicle when I froze for half a second on a dark road, someone who had literally kept me alive. I wrote her name carefully, knowing she would never expect it. Then I moved to the emergency contacts section and erased my father number in its place. I put my first sergeant and the number for the legal office on post. If something happened to me, I wanted the call to go to someone who understood the reality of my life, not to people who saw it as a talking point. I did not announce any of this. There was no angry phone call, no dramatic confrontation. Just a quiet rerouting of lines on a page, a silent revenge built entirely out of ink and intention. They still believed they had the right to speak for me, to use my service, my sacrifice, my pay as part of their story. But on paper, the Army now recognized a different truth, that the people who had earned a claim on my life and death were not the ones who used my deployment money, like an ATM. And while they sat at home telling neighbors our girl is off playing soldier, I was steadily cutting the strings that let them treat me like their property. Coming home from my second deployment felt different from the first, as if something essential inside me had shifted without asking permission. The air at Fort Campbell was cool in the mornings and thick by afternoon, and each time a training blast echoed from the range, my heart would slam itself against my ribs before my brain could catch up and say, "You are safe now, the mission is over." But my body did not care about logic. It kept flinching at shadows and replaying sounds I had tried for months to ignore. Nights where the worst sleep came in short, ragged stretches broken by dreams that ended in the same jolt of adrenaline. I would wake up drenched in sweat, staring at the ceiling, counting breaths, until morning finally arrived. After a week of pretending everything was fine, I went to the VA clinic near base. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and old carpet. The nurse took my vitals. The doctor asked about nightmares, triggers, concentration. All the questions I had tried to avoid when he finally said, "This is PTSD, Avery." It made sense, in a way that felt both grounding and terrifying, because naming it meant I could treat it, but naming it also meant it was real. Not just fatigue or stubbornness or something I could outrun on a ruck march. I left with pamphlets, a referral, and a quiet relief I did not know I needed. I did not tell my father or Cynthia the last time I had opened a window into my military life. They had slammed it shut, so I kept this to myself as I drove to their house for the 4th of July gathering in Clarksville. Their neighborhood was already buzzing with kids chasing each other, grills smoking and flags taped to mailboxes. I walked in wearing jeans and a plain t-shirt. Cynthia gave me a brief glance and said, You could have dressed more festive soldiers should love fireworks right before turning back to a group of church ladies she was entertaining. As the sun dipped and people began pulling out sparklers and firecrackers, I cleared my throat and said quietly, "Can we keep the fireworks small tonight? The big ones mess with me a bit." I thought if I said it early enough and politely enough, they might adjust instead. Cynthia let out a delighted, mocking laugh, loud enough for everyone around her to hear our big, tough soldier is scared of fireworks. You know, other people have real problems, right? The words hit like a slap, sudden and humiliating, and before I could decide whether to respond, a cousin jumped in with an exaggerated flinch, pretending to duck. Others giggled and mimicked startled reactions, turning something I was actively fighting through into a cheap family joke. I stood there with a frozen smile, while the sky bloomed with color I could not look at without feeling my stomach twist. I excused myself to the porch and pretended to take a call until my pulse slowed. A few weeks earlier, my unit had presented me with a plaque and a challenge coin recognition for leading a convoy through an ambush with 0 casualties. A quiet nod to Valkyrie 3 and what that night had demanded of all of us. The first sergeant had pressed the coin into my palm and said, "Not everyone could have held that line, Calder. You earned this." The hard way I had carried the plaque to my father house that afternoon, because some small part of me still wanted him to see a piece of my world, maybe even be proud of it. I set it gently on a shelf in the garage, thinking it was neutral ground, not in the house, not in the way, just present enough to say this is real. A week after the 4th of July, I stopped by again. My father was out running errands, and Cynthia was rearranging storage bins in the garage. She glanced at me, then casually nudged a trash bag with her foot inside. I could see the plaque, the coin, and a layer of dust she had not bothered to shake off. I reached in and pulled it out, and she said, without looking up, "Dusty war junk. Avery, we are not turning this house into some PTSD shrine." Her voice smooth, dismissive, the same tone she used when talking about clutter she planned to sell or donate. She did not even pause long enough to register that she had thrown away the most meaningful recognition I had ever received. Something inside me sank lower than it ever had, deeper than shame, deeper than frustration. It was a quiet severing, as if I finally understood at a bone-deep level that nothing I did, no sacrifice, no risk, no medal would ever shift the way she saw me, and worse, the way my father let her see me. The humiliation was sharp, but the clarity that followed it was sharper. The house I kept trying to fold myself into could not hold who I had become, and the family I kept defending in my mind had no intention of defending me back. That night when I returned to my apartment, I sat at my kitchen table with a pen, my SGLI paperwork spread out beside me, and a memory of Sergeant Donna Hayes' steady voice in my ears. She was older than me, mid-40s, deployments, the kind of woman who listened before she spoke and always noticed when someone was struggling. Even if they tried to hide it during deployment, she had sat with me on steps, in the dark, handed me water, walked me through breathing until I stopped shaking. She'd never made my fear feel like failure. She'd never needed me to be anything other than exactly who I was in that moment. And in many ways, she had been more of a mother in 2 deployments than Cynthia had been in a decade. I wrote her name in the next of kin line, the ink steady under my hand. Sergeant Donna Hayes, not my father, not Cynthia, not Bella. If something happened to me, she would be the one notified, not because she asked for the responsibility, but because she had earned my trust with consistency and compassion and a level of loyalty my family had never shown. I added the number for the JAG office as secondary, a small legal boundary I wished I had set years earlier. When the forms were signed and filed, I felt lighter, not happy but anchored. I had taken back something that belonged to me alone. I had carved out a version of family that reflected truth instead of obligation, and for the first time I let myself accept that chosen family did not diminish real family, it revealed what real family actually meant. The next weekend I bought a glass display case, small but sturdy, and carried it into my apartment. I placed the plaque and coin inside, added a few other items from deployment, small pieces that meant something to me, even if they meant nothing to anyone else. I arranged them slowly, carefully, almost reverently building a shrine, not to war, but to survival, to leadership to the soldiers who had stood beside me, and the woman I had become a version of myself that did not need validation from people who had never bothered to understand the weight I carried. By the time I closed the case, I knew something important had shifted. That night in the garage had been the last time I allowed my family to define the value of my service or the shape of my life. The legal papers were the first quiet declaration of independence, and the shrine was the second, a private promise that my identity no longer lived in the shadow of Cynthia opinions or my father's silence. I had drawn a line they could not see and could not cross, and from that moment forward they were no longer the family I built my choices around. Donna was my family on paper, my unit was my family in practice, and the people who threw away my medal were nothing more than voices fading behind me as I stepped toward the person I was meant to be. Coming out of that 4th of July and the plaque in the trash, I threw myself even harder into the only world that made sense. By late 2023, I was a first lieutenant with the 101st Airborne on another deployment in Iraq. The heat rose off the road. Dust and fuel settled into my uniform. My sleep was still broken and the VA appointment sat on my calendar. But when I was with my soldiers, the noise in my head thinned out, and their safety gave my mind something solid to hold. The night that changed everything began like any other convoy mission. A cramped tent maps on a table. Radios checked vehicles lined up in the dark. I moved among my soldiers, tightening straps, scanning faces, listening for the nervous jokes that meant they were scared, but steady feeling that quiet just before you drive onto a road that might bite. We rolled out before dawn in flat gray light. I sat in the front vehicle behind the driver headset, snug counting intersections and culverts, watching ditches where danger likes to hide. A small voice said it felt too clean, but I pushed it down. Leaders cannot live in that voice. The blast hit the third vehicle, a heavy punch that threw dust and metal into the air. Our truck lurched. The radio exploded with noise call signs over each other, reports cut by static. The convoy shuddered to a halt, training shoved ahead of fear. I checked my driver, my gunner, my own limbs, then grabbed the mic while my ears still rang. Someone shouted, "Valkyrie 3, what is your status?" And his voice cracked enough to tell me everyone was hanging on my answer. I kept my voice calm. Vehicle 1 is up. Vehicle 3 took the blast. We are staying engaged. Then I started issuing orders, lead and trail, to establish security gunners to scan for muzzle flashes, dismounts to the flanks. Almost on cue, the first rounds cracked past small arms from the left, sharp snaps that turned the truck into a cage. A young specialist yelled, "Mom, they are firing from the rooftops," and I heard panic rushing his words. For a heartbeat, Cynthia's voice flashed through my mind, her calling my work playing soldier. The words lowly military profession said in front of neighbors. Anger rose and then cooled into something harder. "Nobody dies today," I said into the radio, flat and hard. "Do what I say and move." I called for smoke, shifted a rear vehicle to shield the wounded, pushed the medic team in short bounds, my brain mapping that road in fast pieces, blast site, likely firing positions, blind spots we could not occupy. Minutes stretched thin air support was slow higher headquarters asked for updates. We barely had time to give. The platoon leader in the third vehicle stayed silent, and fear kept trying to claw up my throat. I pushed it down with each order, refusing to let anyone bunch up or freeze, making them move, making myself move. When the firing finally began to thin and the first distant thump of friendly aircraft reached us, it was like a window opening in a locked room. The volume on the chaos turned down one notch, not gone, but manageable. We marked likely enemy positions adjusted so we did not end up under our own cover fire, and kept counting heads alive, wounded. But breathing alive, the word killed never came. and I clung to that. Hours later, we rolled back through the gate vehicles, scarred and limping dust, turning the evening light. Harsh. Medics peeled the worst wounded toward care. The rest of us formed a knot near the truck's faces drained. Someone joked that my command voice had scared the shooters more than our guns, and a few people actually laughed. The young specialist from the rooftop call looked at me and said, "We are alive because of her mom will never say it, but we all know it." No one argued, they just nodded a small verdict settling between us. About a week later, my company commander told me to report to battalion. I walked in wearing a pressed uniform and boots that still remembered sand. The battalion commander and sergeant major were waiting with the operations officer and a public affairs captain. They walked me through the after-action review, pointing to decisions that had felt automatic, the way I kept a jittery driver from blocking the only exit lane, the staggered movements that denied the shooters an easy pattern. Finally, the commander leaned back and said, "We are recommending you for a Bronze Star with Valor Calder. You kept that from turning into a memorial, and not everyone can do that under fire." The public affairs officer asked if I would sit for a short interview. Nothing public, just a leadership piece for internal training. They wanted young lieutenants to see what it looked like when someone stayed functional in the dark tunnel. Part of a mission, I agreed. Even though the idea of a camera made my stomach twist, we filmed in a plain room, me in uniform, talking through each phase, overlaid with clips from helmet cameras, smoke-shouted commands, bodies moving through a narrow field of view. It was not glamorous. It was just the work of keeping people alive when every instinct is telling them to run or shut down. The training shop pushed the video across the division and then to other brigades. A friend wrote that they were watching it in development sessions, that recruiters had started mentioning the Valkyrie 3 convoy when they talked to officer candidates about responsibility. My call sign turned into a shorthand lesson, a way to say this is how you do it without needing me in the room. A short article ran in Army Times about the award recommendation. My name on the page with the words, "Led convoy out of complex ambush with 0 casualties." I saved a screenshot and hovered over my father contact, imagining him opening the link, seeing my face reading strangers describe the night that had carved a line in my memory, maybe feeling some small shock that the girl he had sent to the kids' table had become the officer whose voice held a convoy together. But the picture that rose right behind that was Cynthia, tossing my earlier plaque into a garbage bag, calling it dusty war junk, joking about not turning the house into a PTSD shrine. Hearing her laugh again, I lowered my hand. There was no reason to hand them another piece of my life so they could decide how little it mattered. No one from home called or wrote when the metal packet went up the chain. No cousin texted to say they had seen the article. No parent asked if I was all right after the ambush. The only people who kept checking on me were the ones who had been close enough to smell the smoke. One evening after a briefing, my battalion commander stopped me at the doorway and said, "You do realize you are famous now, right? Calder troops across bases are sharing your story. They know Valkyrie 3, even if they have never met you." I smiled and told him I was just doing my job, but walking back to my room, his words settled in my chest. Out here in the world, my family dismissed, as lowly, my name carried weight, and my choices had become a quiet legend. And back in Tennessee, I was still the girl parked on the edge of the table that split between who I was and who they chose to see was no longer just painful. It was fuel, and it was going to matter the next time our paths crossed. Early 2024 at Fort Campbell. I was doing what I always did after deployment, burying myself in training schedules and turning a tired platoon into a steady team. The Valkyrie 3 story had become background noise in the brigade, something instructors referenced, something young troops whispered about. But for me, it was just another mission that ended well. My glass case of plaques and coins sat in my apartment like a quiet answer to the toxic family narrative I had grown up in, proof that my so-called lowly military profession carried real weight somewhere. One cold morning, my company commander told me, "Battalion wants to see you. Calder, bring a notebook." I walked into headquarters braced for bad news and instead found the battalion commander, the sergeant major, and the S1 waiting with small smiles and a stack of papers. The commander slid one toward me and said, "Congratulations, Captain Select Calder promotion list. Posted this morning you are pinning on captain and taking command of a company." For a second the words did not land, then I saw my name tied to the rank and the position company commander, responsible for roughly 200 soldiers, and my chest tightened with something like awe. "You are one of the youngest women to command a company in this brigade," the commander added. "Your call sign is already legend. Now we are giving you the colors to match the sergeant." Major laughed and said, "The troops already listen to you, like you outrank your caller. This just catches the name tape up." Pride moved through me, not the shallow pride of impressing relatives, but the steady kind that comes when people who see you every day decide you are worth trusting, with more lives. It felt like quiet justice after years of family betrayal, a counterweight to every time Cynthia had rolled her eyes at my career. After we finished talking through dates and inventories, a public affairs captain lingered by the door. When the others left, she closed it and said, "We have been looking for real stories about emotional resilience. After war examples we can show to civilians and young soldiers that are more than slogans. Your convoy mission keeps coming up, and so does the way your company talks about you." She glanced at her notes and continued, "We heard your dad, 60th is in June in Clarksville. What would you think about a surprise ceremony near his place, a company formation on the lawn reading your citation, letting your community see the woman behind Valkyrie 3? My answer came out flat and honest. My family barely tolerates my uniform. I said they treat my career like a phase. They laugh about my lowly little military job in front of neighbors. I do not know if bringing 200 soldiers to their street is smart." The captain did not flinch. She just nodded slowly. "I get it," she said, "but this might not be for them. It might be for your soldiers and for you. The young ones already see you as the officer who walked them out of that ambush. The Army is willing to stand behind that in public sometimes. That kind of quiet exposure is its own justice. Think about it. We do not have to do it if you do not want it." For a few days, I tried to push the idea aside and immerse myself in learning everything I could about the company I was taking. I walked the motor pool, memorized names, watched how sergeants carried themselves, how soldiers reacted when they heard I was coming in as commander. At night, the picture kept coming back, a quiet Tennessee street lined with Humvees, 200 soldiers in formation, neighbors filming my father on the porch, caught between pride and confusion. Cynthia trying to decide whether to smile or hide, no one able to pretend anymore that my life was small. I sat down with Donna at the coffee shop near the chapel and laid it all out. The promotion, the proposal, my resistance. She listened with the same calm that had steadied me overseas. "You do not owe them a show, Avery," she said first, her voice firm. Not 1 second she let that sink in, then added, "But you do owe yourself the truth, and sometimes the cleanest revenge is just letting the truth stand in the same place where the lies were born. You do not have to call them toxic or cruel. You do not have to list every family betrayal. You just have to exist in the full light of what you have earned and let their version of you shrink in comparison." Her words settled in the same place where the scholarship dinner, the deployment money, the PTSD jokes, and the plaque in the trash all lived a knot of hurt and strength. I realized this was not about humiliating my family. It was about refusing to hide the person the Army knew me to be just because my stepmother preferred the story where I never quite measured up. It was about revenge through truth, not through screaming. The next day, I went back to public affairs and said yes, but with boundaries. The formation stays outside on the lawn. I said nobody goes into the house. The remarks focus on the soldiers, the mission, the Bronze Star with valor, the promotion. No names of relatives. If any local news shows up, they get a straight military story. This is about service and conflict justice, not about dragging my family on camera. The captain smiled. Deal. She said, clean professional, all by the book. Planning started like any other operation. My incoming first sergeant coordinated routes and timing staff, worked with the city on traffic, and noise protocol checked flags and microphones. I kept my requests simple. Company in full formation, citation read aloud, assumption of command orders published on the grass. No extra fireworks. The power would be in the contrast between Cynthia lowly profession line and the sight of 200 soldiers standing at attention in front of her house. On my own time, I wrote a handful of short notes and dropped them in the mail. A couple of women from Cynthia Church circle the neighbor who once asked when I would quit playing soldier and get a real job. An aunt who had repeated those words at Thanksgiving in each card I wrote. My dad's 60th birthday is coming up. There might be a small ceremony near the house that afternoon. If you are in the area, you are welcome to stop by. I signed just Avery, no rank. No clue that Valkyrie 3 was inviting them to watch the truth walk up the driveway. As June crept closer, my father texted about barbecue plans and guest lists. I answered politely and said little, holding my own plan like a classified document. For the first time, the ground between us felt level. I was not the girl waiting to see how they would embarrass me. I was the officer designing the terrain. The dangerous idea that had sounded almost ridiculous when the captain first said it had become a deliberate move. Quiet justice wrapped in ceremony, ready to bring 200 soldiers to a street in Clarksville and let my so-called lowly life speak for itself in a language even my toxic family could not laugh away. The morning of my father's 60th birthday in June 2024 dawned bright and soft over Clarksville, the kind of Tennessee Saturday that makes neighbors drag grills into driveways and plant flags in flower beds. By noon, his street looked like a postcard, little American flags stuck in the grass, a banner that read, Happy 60. Frank drooping slightly between two trees, country music floating out of a Bluetooth speaker near the porch, kids racing each other with water guns, while adults clustered around coolers and folding chairs, the whole scene so perfectly ordinary that it was almost hard to believe what was coming down the road later. I parked a little down the block and sat in my car for a moment, my dress uniform crisp and unfamiliar against the fabric of the seat metals lined. Just so, rank shining on my shoulders, I checked my reflection in the rearview mirror, not out of vanity, but to make sure the woman looking back at me was the one my soldiers saw and not the teenager who used to be sent to sit with the kids. I took a slow breath, reminded myself this was my father's birthday, not a battlefield, and stepped out into the June heat. A couple of neighbors glanced over their eyes, catching on the uniform. One man lifted his hand and said, "Thank you for your service," in that automatic way Americans have learned. I nodded and smiled, feeling a private irony settle in my chest. Here strangers could manage more baseline respect than my own family had in years. I walked up the driveway, the banner overhead, the smell of burgers and charcoal wrapping around me, and heard Cynthia before I saw her. She was standing near the folding table, loaded with food, wearing a red blouse and white capri pants, like a themed outfit, talking animatedly to a group of church friends, when she turned and spotted me. Her eyes traveled from my shoes to my face and back again. She gave a small, theatrical sigh and said, "Oh, you wore the costume." Her lips curving in a smile that did not reach her eyes, like my uniform was a party trick and not the formal skin of my life. A couple of her friends tittered politely, glancing between us as if waiting to take their cue. I forced my shoulders to stay relaxed, kissed my father's cheek when he came over. He smelled faintly of smoke and aftershave. His eyes were a little watery. Whether from emotion or grill smoke, I could not tell. He stepped back and said, "You look sharp, kiddo." The words were simple and hesitant, like he was testing them before I could answer. Cynthia clapped her hands and said, "Seating is over here. Adults at the main table. Kids and overflow on the side." She picked up a place card with my name in small letters and set it at the table against the side of the house where the younger cousins and a couple of college kids were gathering. She said, "Kids love uniforms. Sit with them. Adults are talking careers up here." Her tone light, dismissive, claiming the power to sort people into categories as easily as she arranged serving platters. I looked at the main table, saw Bella seated near my father with a little chalkboard sign propped beside her that said, "Future Doctor," saw the faces of Cynthia friends turned toward that end of the table with obvious interest, then looked at the side table where paper plates and plastic cups waited a cluster of teenagers already scrolling on their phones. I could have argued, could have said, "I am 30 and have led more people than everyone at your table combined." But I felt the familiar weight of old battles that never changed anything, and instead just nodded, taking my place at the edge of the kids' table, the medal on my chest, catching a stray ray of sunlight that no one there seemed to notice. As we filled our plates, the din of conversation swelled, talk of mortgage rates, vacation plans, church events, Bella residency prospects. I listened to my cousins debate music and streaming shows, the normal chatter, a strange backdrop to my awareness of the exact time on my watch, the routes my company would be taking from Fort Campbell, the message my first sergeant would send when they turned onto this street, each minute ticking closer, like the slow drop of a roller coaster you have already committed to ride. When most people had finished eating, Cynthia stood glass in hand and tapped it with a fork. Until the noise died down, she launched into a speech about my father being a rock, a provider, a man blessed with a beautiful blended family. Then she pivoted smoothly, as always, to Bella. "Our Bella," she said. "Our future doctor. She is the pride of this family. Can we all just take a moment to celebrate how hard she has worked?" The table erupted in applause. Guests turned their bodies toward Bella. Someone whistled. My father's eyes shone with uncomplicated pride as he patted Bella's shoulder. I clapped too because I was not angry at her. None of this was her fault, but I could not help noticing in the quiet tallying place inside me how easily the words "pride of this family" rolled off Cynthia's tongue, how naturally everyone accepted that designation. When the applause faded, one of my father's old co-workers, a man who remembered me from middle school, looked past the main table and spotted me in uniform at the side. He raised his glass and called out, "So Avery, what are you up to these days, still Army?" I smiled and kept my voice easy. "I am still at Fort Campbell," I said, "just got new responsibilities." I let the word hang there. True and unobtrusive, an opening for anyone who wanted to ask more. For half a breath, the space between us felt open. Then Cynthia slid into it like water finding a crack. "She means she is still stuck in that lowly military profession," Cynthia said brightly, turning the eyes back to her with a practiced tilt of her head. "It is cute, really. Like extended college with uniforms." A few people laughed, not all of them wholeheartedly, but enough to echo. My father did not correct her, did not say, "Actually, she is a company commander now," or "She just got a medal for pulling a convoy out of an ambush." He stared at his plate and made a small sound that was neither agreement nor protest, a non-committal noise that somehow landed on my skin like betrayal. The words "lowly military profession" sat heavy in the air, heavier than the humidity, heavier than the smell of smoke and sauce. I felt them sink past the dress fabric, past the shine of my rank, and the weight of my ribbon racked down into old scar tissue, stacked on top of the scholarship dinner comment, the deployment money lecture, the fireworks joke, the plaque in the trash. Each one a layer in a slow-building wall between us at the kids' table. A teenager snickered, then caught my eye and looked away, embarrassed, already learning the family rule that you laugh with the powerful and fall silent with the uncomfortable. I did not argue. My tongue tasted like metal words crowded behind my teeth with nowhere safe to land. Instead, I turned my head slightly and looked past the edge of the tent, past the cars lining the curb to the slice of street visible between two houses. In the distance, I could not yet hear engines, but I knew exactly where my company was in the timeline. We had rehearsed. I pictured them forming up at the staging area, checking uniforms, lining up flags. My first sergeant glancing at his watch and then at the road. The entire machine of the military moving toward this ordinary block party, like a tide creeping in so slowly, no one on the shore realizes what is happening until the water is around their ankles. Conversation around me picked up again. Cynthia laughing, Bella answering questions about hospitals and specializations, my father talking to a neighbor about roofing. But the sound felt muffled like I was underwater, my pulse beating in my ears, in time with the cadence only I could hear. I thought about every time I had tried to share my world with them and been met with mockery or dismissal about the soldiers who had written, "We are alive because of her," and how not one of those words would ever come out of Cynthia's mouth. Unforced, the anger that rose this time was different, less like a fire and more like a cold, steady wind. It did not make me want to shout. It made me want to let them sit exactly where they were when truth arrived. As Cynthia launched into another joke about my little job and how at least the Army had taught me how to follow orders in the kitchen, my phone buzzed in my pocket, a small, insistent vibration against my hip. I slid my hand down and glanced at the screen under the table. 3 words from my first sergeant flashed up from a blocked-out number. "Valkyrie, we are here." I looked back up at Cynthia as she laughed my father as he pretended not to notice the cruelty the neighbors and church friends who had always accepted her version of me. And for the first time in my life in that yard, I felt completely calm because the formation was already on its way down that quiet Tennessee street, and there was nothing anyone at that table could do to stop what they were about to see. The vibration of my phone was still humming faintly in my hand when I slipped it back into my pocket. The air around the tables had shifted in some way, only I could feel like the moment before a storm breaks. When the leaves go still, I kept my face neutral, as Cynthia launched into another lighthearted complaint about how the Army had probably taught me to clean better than I ever had at home. Her laughter ringing out just as the first low rumble drifted from the far end of the street. No one noticed it at first because country music and chatter covered the sound. But the second rumble was deeper and closer. The kind of mechanical growl you do not hear unless you have lived around military vehicles long enough to distinguish them from ordinary trucks. My pulse steadied, not quickened as if my body recognized the arrival of something it trusted. A cousin glanced toward the road and frowned, then a neighbor stood up from a lawn chair, shading his eyes. Someone muttered, "What is that?" and someone else said, "Maybe a memorial procession." The bass from the speaker stuttered as people shifted heads, turning almost in sync, and then the first Humvee appeared slow and deliberate, rolling down the narrow residential street, like it had every right to be there behind it. Another came into view. Then the next a line of vehicles stretching farther than the eye could immediately count, the kind of sight that makes a suburb go silent in a heartbeat. Phones came out instantly, fingers tapping record. The atmosphere crackled with confusion and awe. People whispered, "Are they here for someone? Is there a soldier on this block? Maybe a drill. Maybe a funeral." Their guesses floated across the yard, but no one moved away. Everyone stayed anchored to the ground as if waiting for the answer to reveal itself. The convoy slowed to a precise stop in front of my father's house engines, idling with a steady thrum. Then doors opened in perfect rhythm, soldiers stepped out in full uniform boots, hitting the pavement in a sequence that made my breath catch. Almost 200 of them, forming ranks without hesitation, their movements crisp. Practiced, undeniable neighbors gasped. One woman pressed her hand to her chest. A child whispered, "Whoa!" as if seeing superheroes step out of comic panels into real life. I stood up from the kids' table because sitting felt impossible now. The June heat wrapped around me, thick and expectant, and the soldiers marched forward, spreading across the lawn in several lines. The front lawn that Cynthia had spent years bragging about, the front lawn, where she had just diminished me for sport. Company First Sergeant stepped to the front, his voice booming with command and authority that echoed off siding and mailboxes. "Company, fall in." The soldiers snapped into place, the sound sharp enough to cut the air conversation around us. Died instantly, forks, paused. Mid-air neighbors stared. Church friends stared. Even Bella froze with her glass still in her hand. Then the first sergeant turned toward the house, scanned the yard, and pronounced in a clear, steady voice, the kind used for ceremonies and history books, "Request permission to speak with Captain Avery Valkyrie." 3 called her. The name hung there for a moment, suspended heavy, then dropped like a stone into the silence and rippled outward. "Captain," someone whispered behind me. "Captain," another echoed Valkyrie as if the word was unfamiliar and sacred at the same time. Cynthia's eyes shot to mine so quickly that her earrings swayed her mouth open just enough to betray her shock. Bella blinked, confused. My father stared at me as if seeing something for the first time and not quite believing it. But before any of them could process what was unfolding, the company commander stepped out from behind the formation, walked up the path, knocked firmly on the porch rail, and asked with full ceremony formality, "Is Captain Avery Valkyrie III Calder present?" All eyes swung to me. Even the children stilled the word "Captain" wrapping around the yard with a weight that left no room for Cynthia's usual commentary. I walked forward from the side table with slow, measured steps, not for dramatic effect, but because my legs felt rooted in a new reality that was only now revealing itself to everyone here. I passed Cynthia, her hand gripping the back of a chair so hard her knuckles paled. She whispered, "You did not tell us they were coming." Her voice thin, brittle, desperate to regain some kind of control. "You never asked what I really do." I replied softly. Not cruel, not sharp, simply factual. The truth laid between us like a clean blade. She flinched as if hit by something she had never seen coming. The company commander addressed the formation, then unfolded a folder, the citation crisp in his hands. He read clearly and steadily the narrative of the mission, detailing the convoy ambush, the wounded leader, the chaos, the decisions the 12 lives accounted for, the 0 casualties. He read words like valor and leadership under fire. He read my name paired with bronze star with V device. He read how across bases soldiers knew my call sign Valkyrie 3, because the story of that night had spread far beyond our unit. As he spoke, I watched neighbors lower their phones for a moment, their eyes widening as they realized this was not a simple ceremony, but a recognition reserved for the rare few who survive what should have broken them. Behind the commander, a woman murmured to her friend, "Is that the stepdaughter Cynthia always said was lost and still figuring life out?" Her friend gave a small, incredulous laugh and said, "Well, this does not look like not much to me." The words drifted toward us, and I saw Cynthia's jaw tighten, her eyes darting between the guests she had carefully curated and the formation that had just rewritten every lie she had ever told them. When the commander finished, he stepped aside and the first sergeant barked the call. One sharp explosive word that tore through every corner of the yard, "Valkyrie 200 voices," roared back with perfect force. Valkyrie, the echo bounced off houses and fences, and even the neighbor dogs fell silent then, as one. The entire company raised their hands in salute, directed squarely at me, standing on the worn wooden porch of my father's home. I returned the salute, my arm steady the metals on my uniform catching the sunlight, as if acknowledging years of silence and dismissal. Finally breaking apart my father, mouth trembled. Bella stared at me, like she did not know me at all, and Cynthia stood behind them, trying to gather scraps of dignity from a situation she'd never imagined losing control over. When the ceremony ended and the company held their position for a final moment, I turned slightly as if speaking to the viewers of the story itself, letting the words come as they formed in my mind. That was the first time anyone on this lawn saw the truth about my so-called lowly profession. And if you have ever wished you could stand in front of your toxic family and let the truth speak louder than their lies, then stay with me. Sometimes silent revenge looks exactly like this. No screaming, no theatrics, just quiet justice, and the kind of respect they can never take back. For a long moment after the last salute dropped and the company turned to march back toward the street, the yard stayed strangely quiet. Conversation had not quite remembered how to exist in the new air. Then as the soldiers peeled away in perfect formation, boots thudding in unison on the pavement and vehicles starting one by one, reality rushed back in. Kids' chattered phones buzzed with fresh notifications, and the adults scrambled to rearrange their faces into expressions that made them feel safest. Cynthia moved. First. She crossed the space between us in quick little steps, her smile stretched so wide it looked almost painful. She slipped her hand around my forearm and squeezed her voice, rising in that syrupy pitch she reserved for moments when she needed the room to see her in a certain light. "We are so proud, sweetie. We always knew you had potential." The word always hung there like a lie everyone knew about, and no one was brave enough to name her fingers, smoothed a wrinkle that was not there trying to fold my uniform into the story she wanted to tell. I eased my arm out of her grip, not jerking, not dramatic, just deliberate. "Please do not touch the uniform you called lowly an hour ago," I said quietly. Her mouth snapped shut as if someone had cut the string on a puppet for a second. We locked eyes and I saw something crack. Not remorse, not yet, but the dawning awareness that her words had not floated away harmlessly, like she always pretended that they lived in my memory. With weight and consequences, my father hurried over as if he could patch the moment with enthusiasm. "Kiddo, why did you not tell us?" he asked, trying for hearty and landing somewhere between guilty and excited. "We would have thrown a bigger party." Invited the news, he laughed in a way that begged me to join in and let him off the hook. I looked at him, at the lines in his face, the way he had just stood on that porch hearing my achievements read out loud for the first time, from someone who was not me, and I wanted to feel only softness, but the image of him staying silent while Cynthia called my service a phase and a costume would not move. Aside, "You never asked." "Dad," I said, keeping my tone even, "you never wanted to hear about the missions or the promotion boards or the soldiers. You wanted to hear that this was temporary. Something I would outgrow. I am glad you are proud now. But this did not appear today just because 200 soldiers showed up. It has been here for years." He looked away. That small flinch of a man confronted with the cost of his own passivity. Around us, relatives began their usual cleanup of history. "We were just teasing, you know how families are," one aunt said with a little shrug. Laughter bubbled up behind her words like it could wash over everything. Another cousin chimed in that if she had known I was that important, she would have bragged more, as if my worth had just increased on a stock chart, and now they wanted to buy in. It was classic toxic family rewrite. The kind of family betrayal that tweaks memory until cruelty becomes humor and indifference becomes loving, tough love. I let them talk for a minute, listening to the same patterns I had been hearing since I was a teenager. Then I cut gently through the noise jokes. Do not land when they come from people who never listened. I said, my voice soft but firm, "If you had asked about my work, really asked, maybe those comments would have felt different. But you did not. You spoke over me, not to me." Their faces flickered, some with offense, some with shame, some with the defensive smile of people who would rather cling to their old story than sit with the discomfort of this new one. Within hours, the videos had started to circulate. Church ladies posted clips with captions about Captain Calder and answered questions in the comments about how it felt to live on the same street as Valkyrie 3. Someone uploaded the full ceremony to a community group with the line, "She grew up right here. Can you believe it?" Another said the girl who was always sitting at the kids' table is a combat hero. The words "revenge stories" did not appear on the page, but the tone was unmistakable. It was the quiet satisfaction people feel when someone underestimated rises in full view and forces everyone to reevaluate what they thought they knew in the small orbit of Clarksville. I had gone overnight from the stepdaughter who never quite fit to the officer whose name carried story emotional weight. That would have been enough for me, the exposure. The truth standing there on the same grass where humiliation had once grown unchecked, but the fallout did not stop at feelings. My father, real estate and home repair business, relied heavily on contracts with veteran-owned companies and clients who proudly advertised their loyalty to the military community. For years, he had benefited from that association while letting Cynthia talk about my service, like it was a cute detour. Now those worlds collided in a way none of them had seen coming a few days after the ceremony. One of his bigger veteran clients saw the video and heard through the small-town grapevine about the lowly profession. Remarked the client had served 2 tours and lost friends overseas for him. Military service was not a punchline. It was the core of his life. The story reached him already seasoned with the bitter taste of disrespect. He tracked down my work email, not through my father, but through his own network. The subject line was simple. "A question about your family." He wrote, "Captain Calder. I watched the video of your ceremony, and I was proud to see a soldier like you come from our town. I also heard someone in your family has referred to military service as lowly and has made light of PTSD. I want to be fair and not rely on gossip. Is that true?" The words were measured and respectful. He did not demand that I condemn my family. He just wanted clarity before he decided where to spend his money. I sat with that email for a while, feeling the familiar pull of loyalty and the newer, stronger pull of boundaries. Finally, I replied, "Thank you for reaching out and for your service." I wrote, those words were said. My stepmother used that phrase in front of guests the same day as the ceremony, and there have been comments about PTSD in the past. I cannot tell you how to respond. I just believe everyone should know the full story before doing business. I did not ask him to cut ties. I did not badmouth my father company. I did not spin the story to make myself look better. I simply confirmed the truth. Trusting that truth once released would take its own path, that was the heart of this quiet justice. No screaming, no smear campaign, just revenge through truth. A week later, my father called his voice tight and strained. He talked around what he really wanted to say, mentioning that a big client had decided not to renew a contract, that there were rumors swirling about how his household talked about military people, that it was all being blown out of proportion. His tone skated around the edge of accusation, as if I had somehow orchestrated this to hurt him financially. I listened until he paused for breath, then said, "Dad, I did not tell anyone what to think. I just refused to lie when someone asked if certain things had been said. This is not about me punishing you. This is about people choosing who they want to align with, based on what they value. If you want veteran clients, you cannot treat veterans like the punchline of your family jokes." He went quiet again. Not because he agreed, but because he had no easy answer. That did not require him to look directly at the consequences of his silence. Contracts quietly shifted. A couple more veteran clients chose other providers. Nothing dramatic enough for the evening news, just a subtle but real correction in the balance. My father had been enjoying, his business did not collapse, but the extra cushion thinned. The fancy vacations became harder to justify. The expensive SUV, a little heavier to keep the fallout, was not ruin, just a tangible reminder that betrayal family karma has a way of circling back when you build comfort on top of other people's pain. I did not gloat. I did not celebrate. Instead, I felt a strange mix of sorrow and validation. This was justice without hate at work. The world rearranging itself around truths that had finally been spoken aloud. By late autumn, the glow of that June afternoon had long faded from my father's house, and the reality they had been trying so hard to outrun finally began closing, and interest rates kept climbing. Bella tuition loans ballooned faster than anyone expected. 2 longtime clients ended their contracts, with my father business citing budget cuts. But the timing lined up too neatly with community whispers about the way my family had mocked military service, and inflation chipped at every corner of their lifestyle until the glossy surface Cynthia curated began to crack. She hit it well at church and neighborhood brunches, still posing in photos and talking about renovations. They had not actually started. But stress clung to her voice. In the short videos, she posted something tight and frantic beneath the practiced smile. My father sounded exhausted the few times he left vague voicemails about wanting to catch up. I was not surprised when Cynthia finally called. What surprised me was how sweet her tone was, like syrup poured too generously over something rotten honey. "We are in a bit of a financial squeeze." She began drawing the sentence out like she wanted me to taste her vulnerability since you are this big hero. Now, maybe you could use your reputation to help your father business. Maybe sign something, co-sign a loan, maybe show your face in a brochure. The words landed with the heavy familiarity of every time she had treated me like a tool. Only now she dressed it in concern, letting me know their need without admitting an ounce of past wrongdoing. She did not say, "I am sorry for calling your service lowly," or "sorry for throwing your plaque away," she said, "since you are a hero now turning my career into something useful to her," only because her own resources were failing. I kept my voice steady, not unkind, but firm. "I will meet you, but not at the house." I chose a cafe near the base neutral ground, fluorescent lights the smell of burnt espresso, a place too public for theatrics and too ordinary for sentimentality. I arrived a few minutes early and sat where I could see the door watching soldiers come and go, feeling grounded by the sound of boots and clipped conversations. When my father and Cynthia walked in, they looked smaller somehow, not physically, but in the way people look when the story they told about themselves has stopped convincing even them. Cynthia launched straight into the script talking about the economy, about Bella medical bills, about the contracts they lost, about how unfair everything had been, her voice riding a seesaw between indignation and desperation. My father nodded along, adding that they just needed a little help, a show of support, something to reassure banks and clients, and then Cynthia leaned forward, her eyes bright with forced intimacy, saying, "Family sticks together. Avery, we have always been there for you." The sentence almost made me laugh, not because it was funny, but because of how completely detached from reality. It was how effortlessly she erased every moment of betrayal, every humiliation, every small and large wound she had dealt out over the years. I let them finish. I let the rationalizations spill out until they ran out of breath. Then I folded my hands on the table and began listing the memories they had worked so hard to bury. Not with anger, not with theatrics, just clarity. I reminded them of the scholarship dinner, where Cynthia said the Army was for kids who could not get real scholarships. I reminded them of the deployment money taken without permission, justified as family helps family. While the only family being helped had never worn a uniform, I reminded them of the PTSD jokes, the fireworks taunts the night my plaque ended up in a trash bag because she decided the house would not become a PTSD shrine. I reminded them of the lowly military profession remark, spoken in front of neighbors, only an hour before 200 soldiers stood on the lawn, and I watched their faces shift with each memory. The excuses thinning the entitlement, cracking. When I finished, I said, "You did not see me as family. When I was just a lowly soldier, you saw me as an embarrassment or as an ATM. Now you see me as leverage. I will not be either." My voice stayed calm, no malice, just truth, laid out on the table like a ledger. My father opened his mouth, reaching for the old line of, "After all we have done for you," but I cut in before the words fully formed. "What you did was to me, not for me, Dad." His mouth closed again, the sentence hanging between us like a door gently shutting. They tried everything after that guilt sentiment, appeals to duty, even a half-hearted attempt to claim that helping them would honor my mother memory as if they had not boxed away every trace of her. When I was 12, I listened without reacting, then delivered the only answer I had. "I will not co-sign anything." I said, "I will not appear in your advertisements. I will not attach my rank to your business. What I can do is give you resources, not my name." I slid a small card across the table. On it were the numbers for financial counseling, legal aid for small businesses, and a nonprofit that helped families restructure debt. "This is the help I can give without lying about who you have been to me." I said. Cynthia stared at the card like it was an insult. My father looked older than I remembered, a quiet ache settling behind his eyes. Not for me, but for the comfort slipping away from him. They left the cafe slowly, neither saying goodbye, the bell over the door jingling lightly as if mocking the heaviness of their steps. I stayed seated for a long moment after they disappeared from view, breathing in the scent of coffee and the quiet hum of soldiers placing orders at the counter. My boundaries were not loud, they were not cruel, but they were unwavering, and for the first time my refusal did not feel like rebellion. It felt like alignment, like stepping into a life not dictated by their need or neglect. Within weeks, the consequences arrived. The bank denied their refinance request without a co-signer, citing high risk. One of the larger veteran clients who had been wavering chose to walk away entirely. The loss forced my father to downsize the business vehicle fleet and sell the new SUV Cynthia had been proudly showing off on social media. Their planned vacation to Destin evaporated, replaced with a quiet summer at home that no photo filter could disguise as glamorous. It was not ruin, but it was an undeniable shift, a recalibration of the comfort they had taken for granted, a reminder that actions have weight, that words have impact. That family betrayal echoes long after the moment. People pretend to forget it. I did not celebrate their struggle. I did not share their situation with anyone. I did not take pleasure in the discomfort that came back to them. I simply lived my life at Fort Campbell, stepping more fully into command, guiding my soldiers, building something steady and real. Their fallout was not my victory. My victory was the boundary itself, the refusal to shrink or bend to maintain their illusion. And in its own quiet way, it was the strongest return I had ever given. By the summer of 2025, the sharp edges of that year had softened into something steadier. Not gentle exactly, but grounded, like the feeling of stepping onto firm soil after marching for too long on uneven ground. I was living in a small 2-bedroom house just outside Gate 5, a quiet place with a porch swing and a patch of grass. I kept meaning to reseed a house I bought with my VA loan without needing anyone to co-sign the paperwork. Signed by my own hand alone felt like its own private ceremony, a reminder that independence could be built brick by brick without anyone's permission. Mornings started with coffee on the porch while soldiers jogged past on their way to early formation. And each time I heard their footsteps, I felt a quiet pride settle in my chest, not the loud kind that needs to be displayed, but the kind that lives in the rhythm of responsibility. Command had become a second skin. By then, Captain Calder was the name people called when they needed decisions, clarity, or calm. My company had grown into a team that worked with an ease earned through hard months of shared effort. The younger soldiers looked to me as if I carried an answer for every problem. The older sergeant stood beside me like the steel framework of a building that refuses to bend. And in this strange way, the army that Cynthia had called a phase had become the place I understood myself most truthfully. My chosen family formed quietly around me, not in grand gestures, but through 100 small moments. Donna Hayes came by twice a month with casseroles or barbecue ribs she insisted I needed. After long weeks, she would lean against my counter while I chopped vegetables and talked through the kind of wisdom only a woman with 45 years of scars and survival can offer. Sometimes she told stories from deployment. Sometimes she talked about her own toxic family and how she learned to let distance be its own kind of love. She never pushed, never pried, just existed with me in a way that felt like having a mother again. A handful of women from different units, mostly in their 30s and 40s, slowly drifted into my orbit too. Some had left marriages. Some had walked away from broken childhood homes. Most carried their own versions of family betrayal that they did not talk about often, but that colored the way they laughed or paused in certain conversations on weekends. We grilled behind my house, the smoke rising into the warm evening air while they swapped stories about duty stations and hard lessons. We passed plates and joked about the things only military women truly understand. And somewhere between the laughter and the shared silence, I realized this was what real belonging felt like, not being tolerated, not being humored, but being seen. That fall, I was asked to speak at a local high school for their career day. I wore my service uniform and stood in a gym that smelled of old varnish and teenage sweat. Rows of students slouched on metal bleachers. I told them about emotional resilience, without using the phrase too often, about learning to stand up for yourself when no one else would, about walking a path. People around you may not understand. I kept the language simple, real, not dressed up when I finished a girl with braces, and a messy ponytail stayed in her seat, while others shuffled out her eyes, shiny but steady. She said quietly, "My parents say my dream is lowly too. They say I should be something more respectable." Her voice trembled on the word respectable, as if she was reciting a verdict she had not chosen. I rested my hand on her shoulder and said, "Then build a life where their opinion is not the only one. Build something solid enough that their fear cannot shake it." She nodded like those words were a rope thrown across a fast-moving current, and she was deciding to grab on. My father emailed occasionally now short notes with simple questions about my schedule or how work was going. Nothing extravagant. Nothing demanding the absence of requests for help was its own quiet shift. He wrote without bragging about Bella or apologizing for the past. His messages were tentative, like a man touching a bruise. He was not sure had healed. I replied politely, kindly, but with boundaries firm enough to stand on each message. Was like a small handshake across a distance neither of us tried to close completely. Cynthia, from what I heard through the slow drip of small-town talk, had become quieter in community circles. She attended events, but bragged. Less people said she smiled tightly when soldiers walked by in uniform, her eyes flicking away as if the memory of 200 boots on her lawn rose uninvited each time the curated persona she built had not collapsed, but it no longer sparkled the way she wanted. And though I felt no joy in that, I also felt no obligation to comfort the discomfort she had created by her own choices. One evening, near the end of summer, I stood in formation with my company as the sun dropped low, turning the sky over Fort Campbell into streaks of gold and amber. The air held that stillness that comes after a long day when everybody is waiting for dismissal, but no one has spoken the word yet. I looked down the lines of soldiers, some barely 18, some old enough to remember the wars of my childhood, all of us held together by something deeper than obligation, something forged in sweat training and trust, and I felt the quiet fullness of a life I had built from the ground up. I used to think revenge meant making them hurt the way they made me hurt. I said softly in my mind, not to the soldiers, but to the younger version of myself who once believed pain had to be matched to be understood. Now I know the real revenge in these revenge stories is living in truth with dignity over money, with people who never once laughed at my service, letting the life you build speak louder than the people who tried to shrink you. As the company broke formation and the evening settled around us like a soft blanket, I thought of the girl at the high school of Donna, of the women in my circle, of every soldier who had ever called me mom with trust in their voice, and I felt a sense of closure that did not depend on my family's suffering, only on me choosing the right people to walk beside. And if you have lived through a toxic family or your own version of family betrayal, and you are still here, that means you already carry an emotional resilience they never recognized. If this story of quiet justice and silent revenge spoke to you, type boundaries in the comments. That is how we stand up for ourselves together. This space is for reclaiming respect, learning the lesson in betrayal, and finding justice without hate, revenge through truth, not by becoming anything like the people who hurt us.